It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister Andrea Leadsom, Labour MP Lloyd Russell-Moyle, and Nancy Fielder of the Sheffield Star. Today, MPs vote on whether to usher in £12 billion worth of manifesto-busting tax rises.
Yes, I accept that this breaks a manifesto commitment, which is not something I do lightly, but a global pandemic was in no one's manifesto.
Read my lips. The Tories can never again claim to be the party of low tax.
Will it fix the crisis in social care and the lengthening NHS waiting lists?
We do believe that it falls significantly short of what the NHS needs, both for day-to-day running and also to tackle that backlog of care.
Thousands of migrants land on the Kent coast, despite the Home Secretary's repeated efforts to stop the crossings.
We are prosecuting and putting in prison more and more people traffickers and smugglers, and we will continue to do that.
The Commons packed again and will be for PMQs today, but are COVID restrictions really behind us? Welcome. Well, this evening, MPs will vote on the national insurance rises on both employees and employers, which the Prime Minister announced yesterday in the Commons to fund what he called would be an NHS recovery post-pandemic and reform the social care system. Now, he will have broken two key manifesto commitments by raising national insurance and by changing the pensions triple lock. My question to open the programme is, has Boris Johnson got away with it? Andrea?
You know, the fact is, under COVID, we've had to borrow over £400 billion to protect lives and livelihoods. And so there's no easy answers. And yeah, I mean, Boris was up front. We're breaking a manifesto pledge because of the absolutely exceptional circumstances.
Two manifesto pledges.
Well, indeed, but I do believe millions of people across the country will be hugely relieved to see the government getting a grip of it. There is no way to fund this backlog of NHS operations and procedures that have been delayed as a result of COVID. And, of course, the social care situation is also really struggling and has been for decades. So getting a grip of those things, I think people will welcome.
Lloyd, do you think he has got away with it, pulled it off?
Well, he will get away with the vote in terms of it passing tonight. I think there's very little doubt about that now. And he will have gotten away with rising taxes. The problem is that rather than rising the cap for NI, most people, of course, won't necessarily realise that if you earn under 50,000, you pay 12%, well, will be now 1.25 more. But if you earn over 50,000, you only pay 2%. If he had scrapped the cap, he would have earned more money. He would have made sure that working people, young people, poorer people didn't pay for this. People with the broader shoulders paid. And actually, I think most people would have seen it fair.
You mean raising the cap, the starting point at which people would start to pay?
No, the starting point, the finishing point at which people pay, because people stop paying the 12% at over 50,000. So Labour would have a much more progressive plan to pay for this. And the other problem is that it's a payment for random stuff rather than a proper plan for social care.
Both those points are not true, as Lloyd well knows. The basic rate taxpayer will be paying about £3.46 a week. The higher rate taxpayer will be paying about £17.50 a week. The highest earning 14% will pay over half of this health and social care levy. And as Lloyd well knows, it is absolutely hypothecated, the health and social care
levy. It will be. It isn't at the beginning.
NHS and social care.
Or hang on, because I'm going to get to our other guests. We've only just started the programme. And let me welcome the Sun's Harry Cole. Harry, has and will Boris Johnson get away with this?
A cabinet colleague of Boris Johnson's this morning actually sent me a text when I asked that very question to them, saying, how has he done this? How has he got away with it so far? And they sent back a YouTube video of the Kenny Rogers song "The Gambler," which I think has become a sort of people are sort of can't quite believe he's done it. The Tory opposition to this appears to have fizzled out. Labour are off the pitch this morning. They haven't put out a spokesman properly yet with a formal response. We'll wait to see what Keir Starmer says at 12 o'clock. But crucially, it is very early days yet. As Lloyd just said there, yes, he'll probably get away with it today. He'll probably win the vote. The opposition within his own party appears to have fizzled out for now. But the real test for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and the Health Secretary is going to be in 3 years' time. That's when we will know whether he's got away with it, whether the backlog has been cleared, whether that money is then used on social care as promised, or whether we're going to have the same argument we've had for the last 20 years, more money needed for the NHS, more money needed for social care, and that levy, that 1.25% levy, when it becomes its own, when it's separated off from NICs and becomes its own social care and health tax, that's going to be a very, very big political football to be played with for every election going forward. Parties will promise to raise it or to cut it, or I doubt anyone will actually ever be able to cut it. But, you know, it's getting away with it today is one thing. Getting away with it in 5 years, 10 years, quite a different picture.
Nancy?
Absolutely. It's not now, is it? It's how many people die on waiting lists over the next 3 years. If this is to deal with the pandemic, the NHS and social care were on their knees, as we all know, well before the pandemic. So if this brings us back to levels of 2 years ago, it's not good enough, is it? And that's what voters will see. And we hear such horror stories locally. Everybody does, right across the country. So it's whether it makes a difference. And I'm not convinced it's enough money. Everybody wants these things to be better. Everybody doesn't mind paying a bit more. But actually, is it really going to change it? And sadly, I'm not convinced it's going to change it enough for people to believe that this was a good idea.
So at the moment, there are about 5 million people waiting who've been delayed on procedures and operations as a result of COVID. That could rise to 13 million. What the Prime Minister has said is that the calculation is that the NHS will have 110% of pre-pandemic capacity to carry out those procedures and operations.
Well, he said that, yes.
By the end of that first year. Well, that obviously, you know, none of us has a crystal ball, but actually gripping the issue, facing up to the fact that money doesn't grow on trees, and the alternative to dealing with it in this way is to borrow more money, and that disproportionately affects the young generation.
How you spend the money. Labour, for example, Liz Kendall has laid out a plan about how we would tackle social care.
Well, hang on. What's that plan? You haven't seen it. Hang on, Lloyd. What is that plan? How would you raise £12 billion?
Where is it? There's a difference between a plan of how you would spend it and a plan of how you raise the money.
Well, how would you raise it?
Well, there are many ways that we would raise it.
Right.
And one of those things would be looking at capital gains. One of those things would be...
The Labour Party hasn't said that. The Labour Party hasn't said that.
Looking at income tax levels. We would look at all those different things.
Is that what you're expecting Keir Starmer to do, then, to announce that you're going to look at wealth tax? I've got here in front of me an amendment that's been laid that you have signed, put forward by Richard Bergen and those, I think, broadly you can say, on the left of the party that are saying it should be by a wealth tax on individuals with assets totalling over £5 million. I haven't heard that from the Labour Party officially.
Labour Party, my understanding is, says that none of those things are off the table and we should be looking at the most progressive and fairest way of raising those taxes. But it's not just about raising the money. You know, Andrea there has talked about what is then going to happen with that money to get rid of that backlog. There's no point in promising these nice things about what the money is going to be spent on unless there is a proper plan. Unless there is a proper plan for how that money is going to be spent. What's going to happen is it's going to be whittled away, and in 4 years' time we're going to be back to this argument about how you have a proper basis for people saving for their social care when they're older. And I do think there needs to be some saving elements in this as well, because we need a long-term plan for social care that isn't just about raising taxes and thinking that we can spend it.
That is just despair then, Lloyd. So basically what you're saying is whatever we do, it won't be good enough for the Labour Party. There's nothing we can do.
Well, where's the plan about how you're going to reform social care? Where's the plan about how you're going to actually have 100% extra capacity? Where's the plan to do any of this stuff? Where's the ideas?
Let her answer.
Obviously not. Jonathan Ashworth himself said on the Andrew Marr show only a few months ago that if the Conservatives were to raise a social care levy, the Labour Party would back it. The trouble is the Labour Party has no ideas of its own and yet trashes anyone else's ideas. This is a significant, broad-based national insurance hypothecated tax for health and social care to deal with the backlog and to revolutionise social care, something that successive Labour governments ducked, yes, and Conservative governments.
Hang on.
But we are now getting a grip. Give it a chance, Lloyd.
All right, well, let's talk to an expert. But hang on, Lloyd.
The plan of how
you've said that. We're going to talk.
None.
We're going to try and talk to an expert. I'm not saying that either of you two are not experts, but let's talk to Sally Warren, who I think is with us, Director of Policy at the King's Fund. Welcome to you, Sally. Well, look, you will have heard some of that debate and argument. Will the money raised by the health and social care levy when it comes in fix the waiting list problem?
Morning, everybody. Great to join you. So the waiting list problem, we've really got two different problems. Since 2016, the NHS hasn't been meeting its waiting times target. So we've got a long-term mismatch between the capacity in the NHS and demand for services. But then obviously the pandemic has caused a huge acceleration of that waiting problem. It's really unclear how long it's going to take to clear that backlog. So the announcement yesterday is an awful lot of money for health and social care, but we've got a lot of uncertainty. So, for example, we don't know how COVID-19 is going to play out and what that might mean about infection control processes that are required in hospitals. The key thing we don't know is how many people who haven't presented with healthcare needs over the last 18 months will come forward over the next few months and years. So it's very, very uncertain. I certainly think the plan announced yesterday is a very optimistic plan about how quickly a backlog can be reduced. And I think it's really important that we're honest with the public about we are going to have to still make difficult choices over the next few years, and in particular be honest about how quickly those waiting times will be able to come down, because otherwise the public may end up being quite disappointed that they thought this would be improved much more quickly.
Well, following on from what you have just said, are you confident that the money will be diverted, I should say, to social care rather than just sticking with the NHS to wipe out that backlog?
So that is a risk and an anxiety. We know kind of through recent history that the NHS does tend to have an ability to pull in an awful lot of the public spending that happens in this country. So I think that is a risk. But the really important thing to say is we have legislated for a cap cost and floor model, and the government will be implementing that in 2 years' time. Once you've started implementing it, you can't stop. And what happens is the costs slowly increase year upon year. So actually they'll be required to be able to shift money into social care because they will have a public commitment that's been legislated for, an offer to the public about how to share those social care costs that they are going to have to fund.
Right, Sally Warren, thank you very much. And on that point that Sally has just made in terms of the risk of perhaps having to raise more taxes, let's just take a look at a couple of the papers. Harry's paper, The Sun, on the front page, Bojo's biggest gamble. I think we can then have a look at The Times, which is tax burden will rise to highest in 70 years. This is as a result of the national insurance increases. And then The Telegraph, highest taxes since the war. Are the party still, is the Conservative Party still the party of low taxation, as it likes to see itself?
It absolutely is. Our tax rates are still amongst the lowest. Yeah, our tax rates are still amongst the lowest in the G7. The fact is people are living much longer. The NHS and social care are huge priorities for the United Kingdom, and there is no alternative. We either borrow the money or we raise taxes. And so this government...
It's how you raise taxes, of course, but more generally on that, highest taxes since the war, says the Daily Telegraph.
I'm still...
gobsmacked.
Well, I am amazed at that headline, but the fact is that we still have competitive tax rates compared to other countries. It is all about being competitive. And the challenges that we have with an ageing demographic and fewer people to pay for, you know, in days gone by, there was sort of 10 young people to every older person to pay for pensions and so on. Now that demographic is changing dramatically. There are many, many more older people living longer who need social care. But I did just want to say, in response to the point about whether this money goes to health or to social care, actually those things, it's not one or the other. The point is if you invest in social care, if you enable people to stay at home for longer rather than taking up a hospital bed, it's so much cheaper but also so much better for those people themselves.
But you're comfortable with this situation of the Conservative Party and
high
levels of taxation?
I'm not comfortable.
All right, well, let's have a listen to what Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, said in response to questions about whether there could be any further tax rises.
And I will give you a third chance to rule out this Parliament any further tax rises if you want.
I certainly don't want any more tax rises this Parliament. If you want me to give that emotional commitment, of course that's the case.
Are you comfortable with that answer?
I mean, he is absolutely spot on. Conservatives are the party of low taxes. We want people to get and keep and be incentivised. I'm happy with his emotional commitment to not wanting any tax rises. But Jo, the fact is the global pandemic is a game changer, not for the UK, but right across the world. Every country is having to grapple with the reality, which is that they are going to have to now sort out the backlog of surgery, procedures and the support that they've had to provide during the pandemic.
Right. I mean, Lloyd, how are you going to vote later on? Are you comfortable voting against new money for the NHS to the tune of £12 billion?
I actually don't know how I will be voting later on. I'm going to listen to the debate. I messaged my whip asking where we were whipping and I haven't got the response back yet. I suspect we're going to be voting against.
And would you be comfortable with that, voting against all that extra money going to the NHS?
The problem that we have with this particular tax rise is it's deeply unproportionate. So now a young graduate who is on minimum wage will be paying a marginal tax rate, if you include their student debts, the same as a 55-year-old on £90,000 a year. Now, I don't mean, of course, Andrea's how many pounds in the pence, because, of course, how many pounds overall, because, of course, a percentage does mean those with broader shoulders pay. But at the moment, a graduate will be paying the same percentage, as that wealthy person. And that, I think, is a real problem.
I understand that's your concern. So you could vote against that money.
Yes, because Andrea's quite right, actually, when she said we've got a real demographic issue of course, growing older population. So there needs to be also elements of saving in this longer-term plan, not just taxing for day-to-day spending.
Nancy, is Labour in the right place when it comes to this issue and this vote?
In all honesty, I'm not sure any of us are clear where Labour is. I think that's part of the problem. But I think if you look at the people who voted Labour, I mean, Stocksbridge, Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster, all around South Yorkshire, and for the first time in generations changed their vote to Conservative and had voted Brexit with the promise that the money wasted on the EU was going to be spent on the NHS. And we've heard the lockdown stories of billions supposedly sent to Tory friends on PPE that didn't work. Did they expect that it was going to be them who had to solve this crisis, that it was going to be their money, which isn't a massive amount in the first place, being cut into? I'm not sure they did. And that's why, unless this has a massive transformational impact, which we all want it to have because it will save lives, I'm not convinced that enough is being done to keep those voters on board with the Conservatives. This is not what they anticipated with the promises.
Harry, do you agree with that?
I think it's going to be an incredibly difficult 3 years for the government. Just the vast sums involved, are mind-boggling, and those headlines you read out as well. The Resolution Foundation today is saying that 40% of public spending will now be on the NHS. It's phenomenal, and it's a really funny old world, isn't it? When Andrea, of the right, a Tory, is saying this is a Tory policy and the right thing to do to put 40% of public spending into the NHS, when the party 15 years ago were trying to, bring in an insurance scheme, and then you've got on the other side, Lloyd, a man of the left, saying he might vote against £12 billion more for the NHS. And you just think the pandemic and the 2019 election have upended the usual rules of politics so much, in the fact that the two politicians you've got on now are on such different conflicting places from where you'd think they would be, that actually I would say all bets are off. So strap in. It's going to be a hell of a ride.
I'm holding on. Lloyd?
Well, I think it will be difficult in the long term if people don't see the improvement in social care. So that's what we've got to focus on, and that's why it's not just about raising the money, it's about how you spend the money and how you deliver the improvements on the ground. And I would love to be eating my hat, actually, and I will do that, kind of to my constituents, if we have a functioning social care system and there is no problem when we get to the next election. But I doubt that will be the case with...
Right. I mean, can the government, Andrea, guarantee that waiting list issue is going to be solved, or certainly massively dented, in the next few years?
Yes, I mean, this is £12 billion a year of new broad tax.
So you want a guarantee from them?
Well, I mean, there aren't any guarantees, are there?
No.
We could have, you know, son of COVID could hit in a year's time, and that throws all the balls in the air. That is the fundamental problem with politics. But I think to the point that Harry's made about, you know, we're sort of cross-dressing. I mean, I do agree with Lloyd on his last point, which is that actually what matters is how we spend this money. That's what we really need to focus on, is actually delivering what we're setting out to deliver.
Where's your plan
but where I would applaud the government is in getting a grip on, in the first place, hypothecating it, being upfront with people that this is going to have to be a new tax. It has to be broad in order to raise enough money, and it will then legally set out the imperative, exactly as Lloyd says, to ensure that it does go to the place it's meant to go. So it will transform social care. It will actually improve the experience of people in care homes. I mean, I'm sure you get, Lloyd, as I do, so many constituents writing in saying, you know, what's my mum can't get any help and my dad's in an appalling care home setting, blah, blah, blah. It's got to be improved.
So
we've got
how
to get
do we
it.
do that? How do we improve?
You've asked that question, but can
Well,
I just ask you, Lloyd, one thing? Do you welcome a cap on costs that will be spent by an individual over their lifetime? £86,000 in the 2019 Labour manifesto. It was £100,000. So I presume you do welcome that certainty.
I welcome that certainty. Personally, I would like no costs up front for social care, and I would like to see a system where people save partly through insurance and partly through general taxation towards their older age, and then it is all free at the point of delivery. I think social care must be free at the point of delivery, and then you have taxation, insurance, and then maybe some elements of income, of capital gains and of inheritance taxation. But what you can't have, I think, is people having to pay things up front. And that is a move from even our manifesto, but I think people are right. COVID has changed things, and it has allowed us to reassess things, and I think paying anything up front is now no longer the thing that's needed, because we need a holistic, integrated health and social care, and the basis of our healthcare system, the basis of the NHS that we're all deeply proud of, is that you don't pay at the point of delivery.
Right, let's talk about migrant crossings, because the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, is meeting her French counterpart today to discuss the issue of the number of migrants crossing the Channel and arriving in the UK. The Home Office has said that 785 people crossed the Channel in small boats on Monday this week, and that more than 12,500 people have made that dangerous journey so far this year. Let's talk to the BBC's correspondent, Simon Jones. There he is, live in Dover. Simon, what is the current situation?
Well, it's another really sunny day here in Dover. The sea is very calm, and that means we've seen a large number of arrivals once again today. Border Force have been bringing boatloads of migrants back to the port for processing. Now, yesterday, we believe around 400 to 500 people succeeded in reaching the UK, and on Monday, almost 800 on 27 boats. And that gives you a sense of the tactic that the people smugglers organising these crossings are using. They're launching wave after wave of boats from beaches right along the coastline of northern France to try to overwhelm the authorities, and they certainly at times seem to be doing that.
Simon, what about the threat, as we understand it, from Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, to withhold funds that she had offered France in terms of helping out here?
Yes, Britain recently pledged to give France an extra £54 million, so France could double the number of police officers patrolling beaches on northern France and increase aerial surveillance. But at a private meeting with Conservative MPs on Monday, Priti Patel made plain her anger that more crossings weren't being prevented by the French, and she said she wouldn't hesitate to withhold that money if crossings weren't prevented on a greater scale. I think the meeting today between the Home Secretary and her French counterpart Gérald Darmanin is going to be interesting. The tone of it. Is Priti Patel going to go in and bang her fists and say, you need to do more? Or is there going to be a more conciliatory approach? I think perhaps the latter, because however much the government wants to talk about taking back control of our borders, ultimately this is an international issue requiring the cooperation of the French.
Simon there on the coast. Thank you very much. Andrea, is that the right strategy? Threaten to withhold funds that were promised to deal with this problem?
I mean, ultimately, UK taxpayers will want to know that if £54 million is going to the French to step up patrols on beaches and to intercept small boats as they leave French shores, that's actually going to that purpose. So yes, I mean, of course, as night follows day, if you're not getting what you're paying for, then you shouldn't pay for it. So in that sense, it's correct. But I do think the bigger point here is that this is an international problem. We're seeing huge global movements of people, either for a better economic future, but this appalling human trafficking with horrific results for people. But not only that, but the fact that it's so often the women and children left behind, and it's the young men who are stronger and more able who are getting to the front of the queue with the people traffickers. All of these things is utterly appalling. It's encouraging criminality, and we've got to put a stop to it.
But let's just stick to the political commitment made by Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, to stop these crossings and her engagement with her French counterpart. Do you think it's right, as Andrea said, and as Priti Patel obviously thinks, that if the French aren't upholding their part of the deal, with 785 people landing on UK beaches on Monday, that's the right way to go?
Well, the problem is the French can never uphold their end of the deal if we have a system of immigration laws which encourage this. So I don't know if you know, but how do you claim asylum in Britain?
It's very complicated.
No, I mean, how do you initially make your claim? Can you make it in France? Can you make it in Afghanistan?
It all depends on where you first land.
You can only make an application in Britain for asylum if you are on British soil. So the only way for these people to make a claim, to make a physical claim, not even to suggest whether that claim is right or wrong, but just to make the claim, is for them either to come fraudulently on a visa, travel, business, etc., or to illegally cross the channel. There is no way of saying, OK, come to the British Embassy in Paris, come to the British Embassy in Pakistan or in Nigeria or wherever people are coming from, and make the claim, and we'll assess you there, and if you've got a decent claim, come over. So the rules at the moment actually require you to make that illegal crossing or to illegally arrive at an airport because you made a fraudulent visa. And so those rules need to be changed. And that's how you stop the crossings, not by putting more guards, because you can never have enough guards if people are desperate enough.
Andrea?
There are legal and safe routes to come to the UK, and what Lloyd is talking about what Lloyd is talking about is the absolute route that people traffickers, criminal gangs use to get people to the UK.
Because
what the UK government wants to do, what the UK government wants to do is to tighten up the rules on illegal migration, which is what you're talking about. This is supported by criminal gangs, and to make those safe and legal travel routes much fairer and much easier to access. And that's what the borders legislation is going to do.
Will you open up a processing centre in France? Will you open up a processing centre in global hubs around the world so people can make claims there?
Yes, that is.
But you don't have that at the moment.
Well, no,
for asylum
I don't think that you're right,
for
Lloyd.
asylum claims. You can.
Oh no, not for no. You're muddling two things. There's the legal and safe route to claim status in the United Kingdom, and that
you can't claim status in the United Kingdom unless you've been smuggled over. That is a charter for the smugglers.
That is not.
Nancy, what do your readers think of this issue?
I think it's very divisive, isn't it? I mean, we see hundreds of these people flooding in, and we see hundreds of people losing their lives. Now, obviously, criminal gangs take advantage of a situation, but the situation has to be there in the first place. These people do have to be desperate to get there. And I think often we forget that. So when we have relatable stories of individuals, we feel sorry for them. And we want to do something, but when we're just dealing, we forget there's human beings involved, and we just deal with the numbers. But to be honest, I don't think our country's got a great reputation for making friends, has it? I don't think Priti Patel, we would expect her to go in and be nice to people, but there is only one way to solve this, and that is for everybody to work together. I mean, we're literally an island. We are not going to solve this on our own. Nobody wants people to have to risk their lives to get to here for whatever reason. And it needs to be stopped.
Yes, go on, Andrea.
Take you up on that point. You're talking about people coming from France to England. At what point are they under threat of life and limb in France, which is what you're saying? They're desperate to escape whatever horrific things going on in France. No, they're not. What's happening is they want to come to the UK because they perceive it as more generous, and there are criminal gangs who are facilitating that at exorbitant sums and risking their lives, and they should rightly be claiming asylum if that's what they're going to do in the first country they arrive in.
Nancy, come back.
So France needs to accept everybody, and we just sit here and say, no, thank you, you're not welcome, and we don't want to help anybody. I'm not sure that's a solution either, is it?
But that's not what the UK does.
I mean,
Not what the UK
Harry,
does.
hang on, Harry, the situation isn't working, is it?
No.
Whether it's about where you process your asylum claim, whether the legal routes that are available just aren't easy or accessible enough to the people who do want to legitimately come here without taking that dangerous crossing. And then there is the political issue, Harry, of Priti Patel, who has made this commitment that she will stop the crossings, possible or not.
Well, you're right. It's clearly not working. I don't think there is this idea that there's only one solution that's for us all to work together. I'm not quite sure that's true. I think the French are, frankly, pushing this one a little bit to the elements of the ridiculous. You know, all the money and all the drones and all the shared boats in the world don't seem to be stopping this. I'd like to think that Priti Patel hopefully got some of these promises in writing before she got a chequebook out last year to agree to this cash. So it's all very well shouting now, but you know, if it turns out we've given over the money without having assurances properly legally binding, then I think she is in a bit of bother. However, look, there are different ways of doing this. You know, these economic migrants, which a lot of them are, have made their way across the European Union, across the Schengen area. They're away, you know, which EU country did they enter before they managed to even make their way to France? This problem goes right across the continent. So this idea that it's just, you know, a Britain versus France thing, or it was a Brexit thing and it's happened subsequently since we've left the European Union is nonsense. This has been going on for a very long time. So I do think there is a lot of noise, there's a lot of shouting, but at the end of the day, I don't think any current approach we've taken is working, and there are other options. You know, the Australians had this problem for many years with small boat migrants arriving, and they turned the boats around. They literally turned the boats around, and instead of escorting, you know, the speedboats and the small boats to the shores of Australia, they escorted them back to which islands and which countries they'd come from. Now, look, it's politically unpalatable. It will be controversial, but the idea that these small boat gangs only have to get halfway across the channel before they're escorted by border force all the way through to the Kent coast clearly is a massive pull factor. So I do think the French need to up their game, and I do think the government really do need to, if they are going to stop these boats coming, take some very, very hard choices.
Turn the boats back, and then I'll come to you to ask the same question, Andrea.
I mean, on humanitarian grounds, that would be an appalling thing to do. I mean, fine when the sea is calm and so on, but if the sea is as the English Channel can be, you would be dooming them to death. And I mean,
I'm not suggesting, Andrea, for the record, I'm not suggesting anyone is being doomed to death. But if the border force are able to escort boats to from the middle of the Channel to England, they could very easily escort them to France. And yes, there'll be a row about maritime law, but that's clearly, you know, the French clearly aren't playing by the rules.
I actually think that Harry's got a very good point here about where you return people when they are not eligible, and where they return people to process them. And so that is my point about making sure you have processing centres. But the other thing that I think is important to say is if there was a economic problem in Britain, if we went to the dogs, or if we were in war and I had to flee as a refugee, yes, I might flee over the border to France, but actually I have family who were economic migrants to Australia. I have relatives in America. I would probably try and get to those countries because I would know my prosperity would be better. I would contribute to those countries better, and actually I would have family to be able to support me.
So
I think we also need to understand that many people, of course, it's not good just saying you can all live in France, because there are many other pull factors that are not just about our welfare state, as Andrea put it. It is actually because many of them have links and contacts in this country, and actually that will mean that they contribute to this country even more if we get it right.
So there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of applications for joining family in the UK. Those are legal routes. And also you're saying it's all about France. It's not. People have come into Greece, into Italy. They've made their way across Europe to get to the UK. No, that is nonsense. There are legal routes to go to a country where you have family. And that is the route people should be taking. What's happening? No, they haven't. No, they absolutely have not. And what is happening is that criminal gangs... criminal gangs are taking advantage of people's determination to get to the UK.
Because people have no other route for...
That's not true.
I mean, do you accept it is more difficult, Andrea? It has been made more difficult. Those applications do continue, but it's harder.
No, I don't accept that, actually. No, I think safe and legal routes to settlement in the UK, the demand is absolutely enormous.
All these things, these cooperation mechanisms and these commitments that we made to safe and legal routes have not been fulfilled.
All right, well, before we move on, Nancy, I just want to pick up on one thing about the role of local authorities when it comes to accommodation and housing and the sorts of pressures that are brought to bear on them in terms of housing, either refugees or migrants.
Well, absolutely. And I think if you happen to be trying to run a local authority and they are all cash-strapped, we know that they all suffer from massive underinvestment for decades now. And all of a sudden you've got all these people with so many needs. This is not just like an average British family with their needs. You've got so many needs and the strains that puts on the education system, on health, on everything, then they need more help. It's quite clear, isn't it? I mean, Sheffield housed more Syrian refugees than any other city. And I think it's something that a lot of people in Sheffield are quite proud of, and a lot of people shake their heads and think it's outrageous and why we're helping these people. It's such a divisive issue. But it's quite clear that if you live in the area where these boats are arriving and you haven't got enough funding, well, more funding needs to come from central government, because it is a problem that everybody's got to deal with together. You can't expect Kent to just pick this up and solve it themselves.
We talked briefly, Harry, about the vulnerability, potentially, of Priti Patel. Headline in the Daily Express, which we can show you, Boris set to wield axe in cabinet reshuffle as Dominic Raab, Priti Patel and Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, faced the chop. What are your thoughts about that happening this week, particularly with Priti Patel?
Well, I think Priti Patel, is actually probably, despite this trouble she's having on the channel, one of the safer cabinet ministers. She's got quite a close relationship with Boris Johnson. They were very tight in the wilderness years of the May government. She's the first Asian female great stakeholder. I think it would be a very big move to demote her or even sack her. I don't think we're quite there yet. That can't be said for other members of the cabinet, possibly the Education Secretary, much tipped for a move. I began the week thinking, actually, it would be a bit mad to do a reshuffle now. It's pre-COP, it's pre the, what are you going to do with Alok Sharma after COP if he pulls off some stunning climate coup and gets a big deal there? He's going to want a big job. But having spoken to sources and ministers and MPs and insiders as the week's worn on, no one is denying it, and no one is really, panic. They are at panic stations in some government departments about the prospect of a move. So who knows? I think there is a case for it in the fact that obviously you've had a big week, you've torn up the manifesto, you've spent billions of pounds. It's all about relaunching the domestic policy blitz. Wrestling the narrative back away from COVID and onto some of those election pledges that the Prime Minister made. So if you do want to shake up your team, do it before party conference season, rather than having a load of people give speeches on policies that they want to implement for the next 2 years and then take them out back and shoot them behind the stage. I don't think that's good. That would be a bit of a politically tricky one. But the Prime Minister himself doesn't like conflict.
No. OK.
Is quite bruised by the last reshuffle last February, and so I wonder whether they've even actually made up their mind yet.
Do you fancy a move back into Cabinet, Andrea?
I think I'll rely on Harry's crystal ball gazing. I think it's clearly better than mine.
Come on.
No, I'm really focused on my early years healthy development review.
Right.
I was delighted yesterday the Prime Minister said there's going to be funding for giving every baby the best start for life. As you know, Jo, I've bored you on this subject many a time.
Education Secretary then, if Gavin Williamson is moved, sounds like an ideal spot.
I'm focused on giving every baby the best start for life.
You're a very good leader of the House.
Oh, look, you've got support there from the opposition.
And we had some good banter.
That'll stand you in good stead.
Stuff on youth parliament and youth participation that you really led on as well. I really liked working with you on that. So
and women MPs of the world.
Well.
Afghan women MPs.
While this little love-in has broken out here, let me just show everyone pictures inside the chamber. Of course, it's Prime Minister's questions in just over 5 minutes' time. And you can see it's quite busy in there. It'll probably fill up even more. You may have watched the Commons when it was recalled for the debate on Afghanistan in August. It was pretty packed then for the first time. So is life returning to relative normality, certainly in Parliament, even though case numbers are beginning to rise again? COVID case numbers I'm talking about. We can show you this graphic. The UK daily cases, the 7-day average is nearly 38,500 infections reported recorded in the latest 24-hour period. There has been speculation, rejected to some extent by government spokespeople, about a firebreak lockdown. We can see that in the Times. Government rejects firebreak autumn lockdown as COVID cases rise. This would probably be over the October half term if it were to happen at all. There was a different take in The Guardian, which actually says Number 10 doesn't rule out firebreak lockdown if COVID cases rise. Andrea, do you think that's likely to happen?
I so hope not. I mean, I think, you know, we're seeing now, we just had this long discussion about the backlog in the NHS of elective and procedures and so on. There's a huge price to pay for lockdown, so I sincerely hope not. I mean, it's hard to predict, though, isn't it?
Lloyd?
I think the graph to look at is not cases anymore, because we have got a highly vaccinated population. The graph to look at is hospital admissions and deaths. Now, that is still going up.
Well, I think it was 200...
much more slowly, but that is still going up. And
right.
if that continues to go up, then that, I think, is what will cause...
So what's an acceptable or unacceptable level of daily deaths following a COVID
I don't think it's about
test?
daily deaths. I think it's about trajectory. If it's going in an exponential...
But what is it? Because we had 209, I think,
if it's going in an exponential direction, it's not quite exponential yet, it's more like this, but if it starts to go like that, where you know you're doubling every period, then I suspect that does mean that we need a lockdown. This is also a reason why we should be rolling out probably a vaccine to some of those children that other countries have. And I know the JCVI said that there wasn't necessarily a health purpose for it, but there is a social purpose for it, and they acknowledge that. And that the social purpose might be to prevent another lockdown.
Where are you on the 12 to 15-year-olds, Andrea? I know, rolling your eyes about it, because there's been a long discussion, as people will probably know. The JCVI, who make this decision, said they weren't necessarily going to support it. They were going to leave it to the chief medical officers. We may hear that decision from Chris Whitty and others at the end of this week. Where are you?
In principle, if the vaccine is shown to be safe and of significant benefit to society without significant risk to that cohort of children, then I would support it. I think the issue I have is where who makes the decision. So what I'm feeling worried about is this idea that a child might decide to have it against the wishes of the parent, or that the parent or that the child might decide not to have it against the wishes of the parent. And I think in the 12 to 15-year-olds, that is a very difficult area where you start to undermine families, actually.
We have legal precedent about where children can make decisions for medical purposes on their own, and clearly that would have to be followed. It would have to be the same as children making decisions around, for example, getting the morning after pill. And there's a legal framework for that already. I think that we would be foolish to diverge from the legal framework.
Yeah, Nancy, your view on 12 to 15-year-olds getting the vaccine?
My 15-and-a-half-year-old would have it tomorrow if it was offered to him. To be honest, it's quite nice and refreshing that suddenly they want to be more grow up, so they don't have to go clubbing and drinking. It's talk about vaccinations. But I think most of the teenagers that I come across, and I come across quite a lot of them in our family, are very keen to have this and would have it tomorrow as long as the science is there, and it seems to be heading that way.
Harry, am I right in saying we're expecting that decision later this week?
Downing Street certainly hopes so. There's been a bit of frustration at the slow rate of these decisions being made, and actually, you know, despite the absolute stonking head start that Britain had on the vaccine rollout, you know, we are slightly dropping down the table, the world league tables there, because we are limiting the pool of the population we are giving the jab to. But again, it's an ethical and moral minefield and I'm certainly glad I'm not the one having to make that call.
Oh, well, good. You can sit back then. On the vote at the end of the month, September, to extend emergency COVID powers for 6 months, I don't know the precise date, but it is at the end of September. Will you vote for that?
I mean, I can see the case if you needed to support furlough, or if you needed to make payments to people to self-isolate. I could see the case for having the ability to do that. But in terms of restricting people's lives, some of those more draconian rules, I'd be very uncomfortable just willy-nilly saying, yeah, sure, let's keep that in place. I think any further imposition of those restricting people's lives would need to come back to Parliament at the time for further debate.
Right, so at the moment, you wouldn't be in favour of that?
I'm not in favour of just extending just because we can. I mean, that therein lies a path to, you know, repressive government, which I'm not a fan of.
Where are you? Will you vote in favour of it?
I think Andrea's right. And actually, a lot of the lockdowns were already allowed and legislated for under health protection and emergency legislation that we had already. And I would prefer us to be going back to use those pieces of legislation which have better safeguards than just this rolling 6-month legislation, which I hope, has come to the end of its life.
Right. Do you think the political landscape has changed then, Harry, when it comes to COVID restrictions, when this vote is coming at the end of September? I mean, Andrea and Lloyd seem to agree they really wouldn't be comfortable voting it through for another 6 months.
Yeah, I probably do. There was also the big debate whether you'd ever do this again under the civil, under healthcare laws or civil contingencies laws, because actually one of the major issues of the pandemic in the early days was the difference, the Scottish government doing one thing, the UK government doing a different thing for England, the Welsh government doing different things. There's a feeling actually, if this were, God please no, ever to happen again, that actually you would probably want to use civil contingency powers, which are UK-wide, to have a UK-wide response. So there's definite flaws in this legislation, and I agree with Andrea. The path to tyranny is continuously updating what is promised as temporary legislation. Why not? Why, if another 6 months, why not another year? We'll be into another seasonal flu cycle by then. I just think at some point that a stand has to be taken, and it appears to me that the restrictions we scraped through, with Labour votes last time. So yes. I do think there's a political battle coming.
Nancy, what about the public mood?
I don't think anybody wants a lockdown, do they? But I think we're also very aware that we're seeing many, many U-turns, and actually sometimes the science has demanded it. So as long as the science is leading on it, I think not necessarily we need to keep this piece of ruling in place, but actually we have got to be prepared that this is not over, is it? We've seen a very clever virus that changes and mutates much faster than humans seem to be able to keep up with. And we've just got to keep being sensible and be prepared that it may not be over yet. Right,
well, Prime Minister's Questions is about to start in the next moment or so, so apologies if I interrupt you when you're answering. But Nancy, when it comes then to those restrictions, do you think your readers think life has returned to a relative semblance of normality since the restrictions were lifted in July?
Yeah, absolutely, the vast majority. I think the most vulnerable and the most elderly are still very, very worried. But yeah, most people, particularly now schools are back after summer, most people are pretty much back to how they were.
Do you think people are worried about a potential surge with schools going back?
I think that is a concern. I think that a lot of ill and older people are still concerned more broadly. And I think that the public would really react badly if we had to go into a lockdown again. So we must do all we can do to avoid that. But it has been lovely, hasn't it, over the summer to see people in nightclubs and in beaches.
Well, on that very upbeat moment, thank you to the guests. And I think it's time for Prime Minister's Questions.
Number one, Mr. colleagues and others, in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today. Mick Whitley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the run-up to the last election, the Prime Minister said that it's wrong that hundreds of thousands of people are forced to rely on food banks to survive. But research released by the Russell Trust today showed that 1 in 6 people fear that they will almost certainly have to use a food bank in just 4 weeks' time as a result of the government's decision to ask the £20 uplift to universal credit. That's over 500 families and 1,000 children being forced into food poverty in my constituency of Birkenhead alone. Will the Prime Minister concede that the cut to universal credit is wrong, and will he change course?
Mr. Speaker, in fact, of course, I'm very grateful to everybody who helps with food banks, and they do a fantastic job. But what this government has done throughout the pandemic is to put the most protection for those who need it most across society. And I'm proud of what we've done by uplifting the living wage, and proud of the arm we put around the whole of the British people.
Craig Mackinlay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend offer me an answer to the constituents I have of the future as they sit around a tepid radiator powered by an inefficient and expensive air source heating unit, worrying about the payments on the electric car that they didn't want either, while they watch the growing economies of the world going hell for leather building new gas and coal power stations, because they will be asking me why. Could the Prime Minister please commit to solutions that are technologically possible to reduce Britain's CO2, rather than uncosted commitments, which I'm sorry we'll be hearing a lot of at COP26?
Well, Mr. Speaker, not only has the price of batteries fallen vertiginously, the cost of solar power has fallen vertiginously, but I'd tell my honourable friend, the people of Thanet South, where they have huge opportunities. The cost of wind power in this country has fallen 70% just in the last 10 years. And what I think the people of Thanet want to see, and I'm sure he exemplifies it, is a spirit of Promethean technological optimism, Mr. Speaker.
Come to the Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to ask the Prime Minister about the promise he made to the British people to guarantee that no one needing care has to sell their home to pay for it. Does that guarantee still stand?
Mr. Speaker, what this plan for health and social care does is deal after decades with the catastrophic costs faced by millions of people, the risks that they face up and down the country, that they could face the loss of their home, their possessions, their ability to pass on anything to their children. This is the government that is not only dealing with that problem, but understands that in order to deal with the problems of the NHS backlogs, you also have to fix social care. We're taking the tough decisions, Mr. Speaker, that the country wants to see. We're putting another £36 billion in. And what I'd like to know from the leader of the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, is what is he going to do tonight? The silence from Mission Control in his...
Can I just say, if you don't want to hear the Prime Minister, I certainly do, and I can't hear him. It's not acceptable. Prime Minister, have you finished?
Leader of the Opposition, whether he's going to vote for our measures tonight, Mr. Speaker.
I know the House has been away, but it's still Prime Minister's questions. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I noticed the Prime Minister didn't stand by his guarantee that no one will need to sell their house to pay for care. Let me explain why he didn't. Under the Prime Minister's plan, someone with £186,000, if you include the value of their home, that's not untypical across the country in all of your constituents, facing large costs because they have to go into care, will have to pay £86,000 under his plan, and that's before living costs. Where does the Prime Minister think that they're going to get that £86,000 without selling their home?
Mr. Speaker, as I think everybody understood in the long debate, a long statement yesterday, this is the first time that the state has actually come in to deal with the threat of these catastrophic costs, and thereby enabling, Mr. Speaker, the private sector, the financial services industry, to supply the products, the insurance products that people need to guarantee themselves against the cost of care. And what we're actually doing, Mr. Speaker, is lifting the floor, lifting the guarantee for up to £100,000, where nobody has to pay anything across the entire country. And what we still have to hear from the opposition is what they would do to fix the backlogs in the NHS. And fix social care after decades of inertia and inactivity. What would he do?
Keir Starmer.
His plan is to impose an unfair tax on working people. My plan is to ensure that those with the broadest shoulders pay their fair share. That is the difference. That is the...
Order. Both sides. I need to hear the question. I also need to hear the answers. If there's some MPs who don't want to hear it, and I'm sure the constituents want to hear it, it's not good to shout either side down when they are either asking or answering a question. Please, our constituents are interested. I want to hear, and they'll want to hear. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. His plan is to impose unfair taxes on working people. My plan is to ensure those with the broadest shoulders pay their fair share. I know they don't like that debate. The truth is, his plans don't do what he claims. People will still face huge bills. Many homeowners will need to sell their homes. He's not denying it when he could have done. And the Prime Minister has failed the only test he set for himself for social care. It was in the manifesto. Another manifesto promised, Prime Minister. No good shaking your head. And who's going to pay for the cost of this failure? working people. Under his plan, a landlord renting out dozens of properties won't pay a penny more, but their tenants in work will face tax rises of hundreds of pounds a year. A care worker earning the minimum wage doesn't get a pay rise under this plan, but does get a tax rise. In what world is that fair?
Mr. Speaker, actually the Institute for Fiscal Studies has confirmed that this is a broad-based and progressive measure. The top 20% of households by income will pay 40 times what the poorest 20% pay. The top 14% pay half of the entire levy. Now, Mr. Speaker, he talks about his plan. Well, actually, it turns out I've been scouring the records for evidence of the Labour plan. And I found it, Mr. Speaker. In 2018, the current Shadow Secretary of State for Social Care joined forces with Nick Bowles and Norman Lamb to promote a new dedicated health and social care tax, Mr. Speaker, based on national insurance. The current, where is she? I can't see her in her place, Mr. Speaker. And she said this was to be the country's beverage moment. Well, is the Labour Party really going to vote against the new beverage moment tonight?
Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what an ambitious young member for Henley said in 2002 in this House. What he said in this House: national insurance increases are regressive. I wonder what happened to him. Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister is going ahead with this unfair tax, can he at least tell us this? Will his plan clear the NHS waiting list backlog by the end of this Parliament? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House, indeed the whole country, can appreciate that we at least have a plan to fix the backlogs. And we at least understand, Mr. Speaker, that the only way to fix the long-term underlying problems in the NHS, the problem of delayed discharges, is to fix the crisis in social care as well, which Labour failed to address for decades. And we're going on ahead and doing it, Mr. Speaker. And what I've just understood for him tonight, I think out of that minestrone of nonsense has floated a crouton of fact. He is going to vote against the measures tonight. They're going to vote against plans to fix the backlogs and fix social care. Vote Labour, Mr. Speaker. Wait longer.
Here's Starmer. Mr. Speaker, it was a yes-no question. You either clear the backlog or you don't. And he can't even say that he'll do that. So there we have it. Working people will pay higher tax. Those in need will still lose their homes to pay for care. And he can't even say if the NHS backlog will be cleared. Well, he gesticulates, but they're all breaking their manifesto promises and putting up taxes on their working constituents for this. And, Mr. Speaker, tax rises aren't the only way he's making working people worse off. 2.5 million working families will face a double whammy: a national insurance tax rise and £1,000 a year universal credit cut. They're getting hit from both sides. Of all the ways to raise public funds, why is the Prime Minister insisting on hammering working people?
Mr. Speaker, we're proud of what we've been doing throughout this pandemic to look after working people. We're proud of the extra £9 billion we put in through universal credit. And, Mr. Speaker, I think people in this House and across the country should know Labour wants to scrap universal credit altogether. We believe in higher wages and better skills, Mr. Speaker, and it is working. That's why we're investing in 13,500 work coaches, £3,000 a year for 11 million adults across this country to train under the lifetime skills guarantee. And it's working, Mr. Speaker, because for the first time since 2019, after years and years of stagnation, you are seeing wages are rising, Mr. Speaker. Wages are rising for the lower paid. They believe in welfare. We believe in higher wages and higher skills and better jobs.
Higher wages and higher skills, he says. How out of touch he is. What do they laugh? What do they say to Rosie? What do they say to Rosie? Because Rosie's the sort of person that this impacts on. Laugh away. A single mother working on the minimum wage in a nursing home. She got in touch with me. She will lose £87 a month due to the universal credit cut. A huge amount to her. She will now also be hit with a national insurance tax rise. She's asked for more shifts, and she can't get them. She's unable to get further help with childcare. What does the Prime Minister, what does the laughter say to Rosie? This is a government that underfunded the NHS for a decade before the pandemic. Took £8 million out of social care before the pandemic. Then wasted billions of pounds of taxpayers' money on dodgy contracts, vanity projects and giveaways to their mates. They cut stamp duty on second homeowners, super tax deductions for the biggest companies, and now they're telling millions of working people that they must cough up more tax. Isn't this the same old Tory party, always putting their rich mates and donors before working people?
Well, I think very sadly, Mr. Speaker, what you're hearing is the same old nonsense from Labour, because what they want to do, they want to scrap a universal credit, and I have every sympathy for Rosie, and I admire her and families up and down the land. But the best thing we can do for them is have a strong and dynamic economy. And as I speak to you now, our economy is the fastest growing in the G7, Mr. Speaker, because we've had the fastest vaccine rollout and the fastest opening up of any comparable country, Mr. Speaker. And never forget that he would have kept us in the European Medicines Agency. He attacked the vaccines task force, Mr. Speaker. And if we'd listened to Captain Hindsight in July, Mr. Speaker, we wouldn't have the fastest growing economy in the G7. We'd still be in lockdown, Mr. Speaker. And it's true. And if we listened to him today, we wouldn't be trying to fix the NHS backlogs, and we wouldn't be finally dealing with social care, Mr. Speaker. This is the country, this is the government that takes the tough decisions to take this country forward.
A little more if you listen to Mr. Jones's question. David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that while the recent extension of the grace periods for the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is welcome, it does not yet amount to a permanent fix of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which Lord Trimble suggests is inimical to the Belfast Agreement? And will he confirm that in the continuing negotiations, the government will draw the attention of the EU to the positive advantages of mutual enforcement as advocated in the recent excellent paper by the Centre for Brexit Policy?
Yes, I thank both my right honourable friend and the Centre for Brexit Policy for their analysis. And it's good that the interim period has been extended, because clearly the protocol, as it is being applied by our friends in the EU, is not, in my view, protecting the Belfast Good Friday Agreement as it should in all its aspects, and we must sort it out.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, without consultation, the Prime Minister announced plans to impose a regressive Tory poll tax on millions of Scottish workers. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation estimates that around 2 million families on low incomes will now pay an average of an extra £100 a year because of the Prime Minister's tax hike. Yet again, the Tories are fleecing Scottish families, hitting low and middle income workers and penalising the young. A Tory Work and Pension Secretary, former Tory Work and Pension Secretary, called it a sham. A former Tory Chancellor has said this is the poor subsidising the rich. A former Tory Prime Minister has called this regressive. Prime Minister, isn't this the case that this Tory tax hike is once again balancing the books on the backs of the poor and the young?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman says there was no consultation. Actually, I much enjoy my conversations with representatives of the Scottish administration, and one thing they said to me was they wanted more funding for the NHS, Mr. Speaker. And I'm delighted that we're putting another 1.1 billion into the NHS. And in Scotland, Mr. Speaker, while all they can talk about is another referendum, and I think that is a clear distinction between us and the Scottish Nationalist parties about what are the real priorities of the people of this country.
In Blackfoot.
No answer to the question, because the facts are this is a tax hike on the poor and on the young, Prime Minister, and you should be ashamed of yourself, Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we now know the economic direction of this toxic Tory government. We're going to see furlough scrapped, universal credit cut, more tax hikes for the low paid. Let us be in no doubt, this is the return of the Tories' austerity agenda. It is austerity 2.0. On this Prime Minister's watch, the United Kingdom now has the worst levels of poverty and inequality anywhere in North West Europe. And in-work poverty, Prime Minister, has risen to record levels this century. More Tory austerity cuts will make this even worse. Scotland deserves better. There is clearly no chance of a fair COVID recovery under this Prime Minister and under this Westminster government. Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that the only way to protect Scotland from Tory cuts and the regressive tax hikes is to become an independent country with the full powers needed to build a fair, strong and equal recovery for the people of Scotland?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that is the right priority for this country or for the people of Scotland. And I just remind him, actually, the words of the Deputy Leader of the Scottish Government, who welcomed it when the Labour government put up NI by a penny to pay for national health service. He said, I'm absolutely delighted, there's a guy called John Swinney, I'm absolutely delighted that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has now accepted that progressive taxation is required to invest in the health service in Scotland, Mr. Speaker. I mean, get your story straight. This is more cash for people in Scotland. It's more investment for families in Scotland. It's good for Scotland and good for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The growing populations of Grantham and Stamford require a long-term integrated healthcare strategy. Can the Prime Minister confirm what action the government is taking to implement regular reviews of healthcare provision to meet the future needs of my constituency?
My honourable friend is quite right. He's a great advocate for people of Grantham and Stamford, and the Health and Care Bill will ensure that there are integrated healthcare partnerships bringing together local authorities and local healthcare, but there is more to be done, and that will be done in the forthcoming white paper.
Ed David.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday's social care plan forgot family carers. Yet we're the millions wiping bottoms, washing and dressing our loved ones, whether they're elderly or disabled, ill or dying. We carers just want a fair deal. So will the Prime Minister raise carers' allowance? Will he guarantee proper breaks for carers? Will he change employment law so we can balance caring with work? And will he ensure there are enough professional carers to help, starting with a new visa for carers? Mr. Speaker, we carers have a lifetime of ideas to improve our loved ones' care. So why does the Prime Minister keep ignoring us and taking carers for granted?
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House acknowledges the massive debt we owe to unpaid carers such as himself up and down the country, and we thank them for what they're doing. What this plan does is, of course, mean that there will be a huge injection of support, both from the private sector and from the government, into caring across the board. And I believe that will support unpaid carers as well, since they will no longer have the anxiety, for instance, that their loved ones, their elderly loved ones, could see the loss of all their possessions. What we're also doing for carers is making sure that we invest now £500 million in their training, in their profession, to make sure that they have the dignity and progression in their jobs that they deserve.
Rob Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ainion and Ethel Jones from Mynydd Mostyn Dairy in my constituency have created a real buzz. By serving a self-serve milk facility on their farm for the local community. Sadly, the local council have served them with an enforcement notice, which has led to almost 9,000 locals signing a petition in support of them. Does my right honourable friend agree that businesses that have done their best to survive and diversify over this horrendous last year should be supported and not threatened by the local authority as they do all they can to grow their business?
I thank him for his question, as he knows planning is a devolved matter, but what I can tell him in the House is that we provided business with over £100 billion of support throughout the pandemic, including £1.5 million bounce-back loans to SMEs such as the one he describes.
Ben Lake.
Mr. Speaker, with widespread concern about the HGV driver crisis, I've been contacted by a number of drivers from Ceredigion who believe the decision to increase drivers' hours will fail to solve the problem. They're clear that a long-term solution requires improved working conditions, acting on the 2018 government report on parking spaces and driver facilities, and also measures to reduce waiting times at distribution centres. Will the Prime Minister consider these measures? And to what timescale is his government working to fix the crisis?
I thank the honourable gentleman. I also thank him for notice of his question. We're working with industry to get more people into HGV driving, which is a great and well-remunerated profession, including by ramping up vocational test capacity, funding apprenticeships for people training as a lorry driver. As the House heard earlier on, this is an issue. The career structure of HGV drivers is affecting countries across the whole of the EU. But can I propose that the honourable gentleman takes up his proposal directly with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport?
Richard Drax, close question.
Number 15, sir.
Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to levelling up the whole country, and Dorset is no exception. I'm delighted that the Local Growth Fund in Dorset has contributed £98.4 million to 54 projects since 2015, and I understand that Dorset Council have also made a bid to the Levelling Up Fund to improve access at Weymouth Station.
Richard Drax.
As a former soldier, time is never wasted on reconnaissance. And can I ask my right honourable friend to come and get some good Dorset sea air to visit Weymouth and to see the infrastructure for himself? Because until we improve it, we can't attract the investment and the jobs and prosperity that we desperately need at an ancient seaside resort that needs a bit of love, attention and government money.
I can think of nothing nicer than a trip to Weymouth, which I think was the favourite watering hole of George III, I'm told, by the Lord Chancellor. But I will do my utmost to oblige him.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituents spent hours waiting to get through to someone on the government-issued number for non-British nationals in Afghanistan. Distressed and fearful for his family, he was relieved when he eventually spoke to someone. However, when they thought my constituent had hung up, he overheard them laughing and say to a colleague, "We are having to lie to people. We are giving them false hope. The whole thing is an entire scam." Is it the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, the Home Secretary or the Prime Minister who's responsible for this scam?
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole country should be proud of what we've done to welcome people from Afghanistan. Operation Warm Welcome continues, and as I speak to you, Mr. Speaker, we've already received more than 15,000 people from the Kabul airlift, the biggest exercise this country has undertaken. I'm sorry to hear about the particular case that she raises. Can I propose that can I ask her to send it directly to me, and I will take it up?
Anderson.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now then, we have thousands of illegal immigrants arriving on our shores every single month. When are we going to take some direct action and send the boats straight back?
Mr. Speaker, I share I share the indignation and the frustration of my honourable friend at the cruel behaviour of the gangsters, the criminal masterminds who are taking money from desperate, frightened people to help them take a very, very dangerous journey across the Channel. This is a perennial problem, but my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is dealing with it in the best possible way, which is to make sure that they don't leave those French shores. We depend to a large extent on what the French are doing, but clearly, as time goes on and this problem continues, we are going to have to make sure that we use every possible tactic at our disposal to stop what I think is a vile trade and a manipulation of people's hopes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, my constituency, Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, is the fourth most impacted by the cut to working tax credits and universal credit, and it's impacting families that are working in multiple jobs. £1,000 may only cover the cost for a single roll of wallpaper in the Prime Minister's flat. However, can he please set out his understanding of the plight of the working poor, and can he explain to the House what he means when he says they should see their wages rise through their own efforts?
Mr. Speaker, I think that everybody sympathises with people who are on low incomes, who we tried to protect throughout the pandemic. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, brought forward a package that was recognised around the world as being almost uniquely progressive in the way that we directed funding and support at the lowest paid and at the neediest. And that was quite right. But what we're also now trying to do, Mr. Speaker, is ensure that we have a high-wage and high-skilled, jobs-led recovery. And that is what is happening. And I'm proud, Mr. Speaker, to be a Conservative Prime Minister who is seeing wages rise now for the lowest paid by the fastest rate for many years.
James Ray.
This is, I think, the first opportunity the whole House will have to thank all of those who played a role in rolling out the superb vaccine programme over the last 6 months or so, ranging from the whole of the National Health Service, the military, and if I may, Mr. Speaker, a particular word for the Order of St John Ambulance, of which I have the honour to be an honorary commander. All parties in the House who might have an interest in St John will have an opportunity to thank them personally, if they'd like to do so, in a reception which I'm hosting on the terrace straight after PMQs today. And it might be that you, Mr. Speaker, or perhaps the Prime Minister or others would honour us with their presence just to thank these thousands of volunteers who've done such superb work over the last 6 months.
I indeed join my honourable friend in thanking the St John Ambulance for everything that they do. They've been fantastic, and I've met many St John Ambulance volunteers during the last 18 months who've done an absolutely astonishing job. I don't think I can myself come to his reception, but I hope it will be well attended. I'm sure it will be very well attended. Can I take this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to urge everybody in the country who has not yet had a vaccination, who is eligible for one, to get it as soon as they can.
Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With a net approval rating among Tory supporters of -53, can the Prime Minister get to his feet, put his hand on his heart, promise the country, this House and his own supporters that the Education Secretary is the right person for the job and he's up to the job?
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House will recognise that the Education Secretary has done a heroic job of dealing with a very difficult circumstance in which we've had to close schools, Mr. Speaker, during the pandemic. And never forget. I think the job of teachers, the job of parents up and down the land would have been made much easier if Labour and the Labour leadership in particular had the guts, and he'd had the guts to say that schools are safe, Mr. Speaker.
Julia Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that our constituents, including mine in Hertford and Stortford, should come forward, see their GP if they have concerns about their health, and that his statement yesterday should give them assurance, confidence that this government is there for the NHS and that the NHS will be there for them in their time of need?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're putting another £36 billion under the measure we're putting forward tonight. And I'm absolutely astonished that the party of Nye Bevan has repeated or confirmed today that they're not going to vote for that. We want GPs to be seeing the right people at the right time. We want to fix the waiting lists, Mr. Speaker, and that is the objective of the measures that we're bringing forward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Funding for organisations helping vulnerable or hard-to-reach citizens with the EU resettlement scheme is due to end at the end of this month. My own constituent tried to get assistance from local citizens' advice in March, but funding cuts meant they couldn't help him. He's been unable to get support from the Resolution Centre either and has now been refused settled status. So can I ask the Prime Minister what practical support will be provided to EU citizens still navigating this system, and what does the Prime Minister advise my constituent to do to ensure that he has the right to stay in his home of 47 years?
Well, I'm of course sorry to hear about the troubles her constituent is experiencing, but I would just remind her that under the EU settlement scheme, we have helped, I think, almost 6 million people to settle in this country. I think a number which is far more than double the number that was expected at the time of the Brexit referendum, Mr Speaker, and I think a tribute to the compassion of this country and its willingness to help those who come here and make their lives here.
Tom Bell. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. St Francis Tower in Ipswich has been a beneficiary of the Building Safety Fund. However, Oanda and Block Management, who manage the building, have put a shrink wrap on the entire tower, which is going to be on there for up to 12 months. So many of those tenants who are desperate are living in darkness for 12 months, and they've put bars on the windows so they can barely open them. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that yes, this vital work needs to take place, but we need to balance, we need to do this work quickly with the lives and the mental health of those people who are desperate and are in that tower right now?
My honourable friend, I'm sure, raises a very important point. I will study the detail of what he said. I will ask the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government to take up the matter directly.
Gareth Thomas.
Mr Speaker, working people who are graduates, such as a newly qualified nurse, earning the average wage or under, will face a marginal tax rate of almost 50% under the plans he is bringing in today. Isn't this yet another example of the Conservative Party asking those on lower incomes to pay more so that his privileged friends have to pay less?
No, Mr Speaker. As I've said, the top 20% of income households pay 40 times more than the poorest. And as for pay for nurses, Mr Speaker, that is exactly what this measure funds. And that is why it is so astonishing that he and his party are actually determined to vote against it tonight.
Final question, Peter Bell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This Friday, I have a private member's bill, Asylum Seekers Return to Safe Countries Bill. The intention is, if an asylum seeker comes to this country from a safe country, they're returned to that country, and it would end the problem of people coming across the Channel. Would the Prime Minister urge his colleagues to vote for the bill on Friday?
Mr Speaker, what I can tell him is that we have brought forward the Sovereign Borders Bill, which, of course, will no longer make it possible for the law to treat somebody who's come here illegally in the same way as someone who has come here legally. And I think it is high time that that distinction was made, and people understand that there is a price to pay if they come to this country in an illegal fashion.
Can I just say, there is some disappointment we didn't get through this. Can I just say, an appeal to the leaders to see if we can speed up to get those members who miss out.
Point of order.
No, point of orders don't come now, come after your cues. We've got... What is it relevant to? We've got an urgent question.
And that brings us to the end of the first Prime Minister's question of the new term of Parliament. It was pretty lively, not least because, of course, there are many more MPs in the chamber since the COVID restrictions were lifted back in July. So there's a lot more noise, a lot more atmosphere in the chamber with both Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer and those exchanges. It's time to welcome our guest for this part of the programme. Helen Whitley, very appropriately, the Care Minister, is here, and equally so, Alex Norris for the Labour Party, the Shadow Health Minister, welcome to you, and Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor. First of all, just to take stock of that first session of Prime Minister's Questions, it did feel different.
It did, and in terms of those atmospherics, I think both the leaders actually benefited from having their cheerleaders behind them. I think in particular, given the pretty significant political events of the last 48 hours, you could tell actually that Boris Johnson really felt as if he'd sort of been plugged into the Duracell and actually looked like he was full of energy. And I think also in Downing Street, a bit of relief after a bumpy weekend. I think they believe that their plans for the NHS, this new big dramatic tax rise to fund first the NHS and then social care, I think it's landed rather better than they thought it might. And I think you could tell there Boris Johnson thinks that he's pulled it off. For now, because there are still an awful lot of things that we don't know.
Right, and on that, we're going to ask Helen, first of all, about some of those things. But you're absolutely right, Laura. The questions, of course, from Keir Starmer, purely on the issue of this vote this evening, the national insurance tax rise to pay for this reform of the social care system and to clear the NHS backlog. Let's just focus on the care elements of the plan with you, Helen. What share of the extra money pledged will be for social care and not just to deal with the NHS backlog?
The 5.4 billion of the money during this 3-year settlement is going to go into the social care reforms, which is across the charging reforms so that people have a cap on their care and the reassurance that they won't face those huge unpredictable bills that we know 1 in 7 people end up paying over £100,000 for their care. Plus also there's wider reform of the system funded within that.
Right, and can you guarantee and can the government guarantee that more of that money will go towards social care in a few years' time?
So that is the amount of this for this 3-year settlement that goes into social care, 5.4. Also what I can say, so within this period, the amount to social care ramps up. So at the beginning, the NHS getting the lion's share, particularly to tackle those big backlogs which we've been talking about. And then as the cap on the care costs comes in, the amount that goes to social care increases to hit that 5.4 billion. This puts in place a long-term funding stream, a permanent funding stream for health and social care, which means going into the future, as more people will benefit from the cap on care, more money from the levy can go into that.
Can I just ask one more thing, a simple yes or no, Helen? Does the cap on care costs, and that is the cap of £86,000 of lifetime care, apply to anybody currently funding their own care?
So that will come in as of October 2023. I mean, the fact is, it's a big reform. You know, I'd love to turn it on tomorrow. I received many hundreds of emails, letters, spoken to people, you know, often with a relative with dementia, you know, desperate because they're facing these costs of care right now. We're the government that isn't ducking the issue. Successive governments over decades, we know, haven't seized this. We are doing something about it, but it's a big reform. It can't happen overnight.
No,
as of 2023, your care costs start counting.
But if you're in the care system now, if you are paying now, when it comes to October 2023, you're going to have to continue whatever those costs are, way beyond £86,000.
As of October 2023, that's when your care costs start counting. The fact is, it is a big reform. It's some complexities in it which we might go into. It takes some time to implement. However, some of this 5.4 billion funding, it starts as of April next year. So actually some of that will immediately start helping people who are receiving social care, including, for instance, the funding we're putting in to support the workforce and the workforce skills and development.
But in terms of this reform, you say that over time, more of this very significant new tax will start going towards social care than the NHS. But can you actually give us a guarantee of that? Because the Health Secretary couldn't yesterday. And if there isn't a guarantee, are our viewers really to believe that when we get to 24, 25, 26, 27, the Health Service, for the first time in its history, is going to hand some money back to a different part of public spending?
So what we've got is we've got the figures that what this will raise for the next 3 years, 36 billion. And what we know is of that, we've committed 5.4 billion will go into social care. As I just said, it ramps up during the period as, for instance, the cap and, in fact, the higher threshold at which people get help earlier for the cost of their care come in. So that ramps up. This is a permanent long-term funding stream for health and social care.
But without a guarantee.
But I mean, you're asking me to commit to what future governments, future parliaments would happen. But what I mean, I can clearly say here is, look, this is a permanent funding stream for the health and social care system. I know, and talking to people across social care, they've been crying out for this for years and years and years.
And they're crying today because they don't think it's enough and they don't believe they'll get the money in the future.
I know everyone, of course, you'd always want more money, but it's hard to raise the money. The money has to come out of people's pockets. We're making the hard decision to raise that money. We're levelling with the British public. Now, this is going to cost money, but this is going to give people the peace of mind that they need and a funding stream for social care.
Alex Norris, let's bring you in at this point. Can you confirm whether Labour is going to vote against this evening?
against this evening. I mean, Helen Whitley's just said...
I'm so sorry, Alex, because we just missed the beginning of what you said there, which is not your fault. Just again, are you going to vote against this extra money going into the NHS this evening?
Yes, yeah, we're voting against it tonight. There's no way we could vote for the biggest tax increase on working families in 50 years for purposes, frankly, unclear. Helen Whitley has said what Boris Johnson wouldn't say today. And that's that this isn't about social care at all. It's a tiny fraction of it is for social care. It's not about reform in the slightest. It is money for the NHS because of 10 years of starving the NHS. So, of course, we can't support that.
Right. So how will you explain to constituents in the sort of post-COVID world that you are not going to back £12 billion worth of funding going into the health service and social care?
Well, first of all, we'll start by saying why we're in this situation. And the government wants to hide behind the pandemic, but these waiting lists were growing at a rapid rate prior to the pandemic. Cancer waiting times were not being met prior to the pandemic. And that's because for 10 years, rather than going for growth, growing the tax base of this country so that we could pay for our public services as normal, the government pursued an austerity economics plan that starved our NHS and put it in a really poorly state.
Well,
so,
on the basis of that, why wouldn't you be backing more funding going in then?
Well, we do want more funding for the NHS, of course, and we have said that.
So why are you voting
However,
against it?
What we don't think is fair is that a situation where a landlord will not pay a penny towards this, but their tenant, who earns much less, who has had a really hard time through COVID and their future is still uncertain, will have to pay. I don't think we can support that. I think people would understand that. So I'm hoping tonight parliamentarians will vote with their constituents and not accept this increase.
Right. Do you think it's fair, Helen, the way that it's going to fall on younger working-age people after a commitment from the Conservative Party at the last election to make sure that working people would keep more of the money that they earned, that there wouldn't be extra costs placed on them when you could have wealthy pensioners not having to touch either their home or assets or pay any more?
So a couple of things on that. I mean, firstly, the fact is that this health and social care levy will fall harder on those who have higher incomes. And we know, for instance, that those who earn the highest 14% will pay more than half of the costs of this levy. So actually, it's a really progressive tax. The second thing is that the social care reforms and actually the support for the NHS benefits everybody. All of us use the NHS, have family members who use the NHS. We may see up to 13 million people waiting for NHS treatment, around 1 in 4 people. Now, that's a huge number of people affected. And so it's in everybody's benefit to be paying for this. I'd have to say, I find it extraordinary that the Labour Party are planning to vote against this, vote against extra money for the health and social care system. They haven't got another plan. They haven't got another suggestion for how they would pay for this. And even as we heard in PMQs, the Shadow Minister for Social Care has previously supported exactly this kind of way.
Well, there was a trading of historic claims on both sides in terms of what parties have said over funding of social care, and everybody knows watching this programme that successive governments have failed in the past to put in place a sustainable settlement. But Alex Norris, on this issue in terms of trying to fund it, what would the Labour Party do? What is the alternative funding model for social care?
Well, firstly, to address what Helen just said about being amazed that we're going to vote against it, I don't think she should be, because she herself stood on a manifesto in an election saying that she'd never vote for a national insurance increase, and indeed her Chancellor returned to that theme earlier this year in the budget. So I don't think it should be that much of a surprise. In terms of how we'd fund it, you have to say what the what is first, Jo, because this is not a reform package. This is, the government have already said that this applies to 1 in 7 people. Well, I'm afraid that social care is broken for 7 out of 7 people. So you have to start with saying, what are you trying to fix before you say, how much is it going to cost and what are you going to spend? And we've said to the government, let's vote this down tonight. This is a bad thing to be doing. And then let's return tomorrow. We'd be happy to work with them on a range of tax increases, because there's going to have to be tax increases. We accept that. There are ones that don't fall disproportionately on those hard-working families, including those 2.5 million who are about to lose £1,000 a year in their universal credit cut. Let's get around the table and have a serious go at this, rather than what we've got today, which is a sticking plaster that won't hold. And, I just don't think it will do.
Right, not all spending, Helen, will count towards the cap, will it, of £86,000? Some people will spend more than that cap on their care before they receive financial help.
Yeah, so the way the cap works is it is a cap on your actual personal care costs.
Right.
So that doesn't include, for instance, your food costs or your accommodation. I think that's completely reasonable that it's reasonable that then people will have an income, whether that serves private income or through the state pension, that can be used to pay for their food and accommodation.
Right. I mean, Alex, as you know, many people are facing catastrophic care costs that are spiralling. Labour's 2019 manifesto, which you'll remember, proposed a cap of £100,000 on care costs. Is that still your policy? And presumably you do embrace, then, a cap on costs?
Jo, we lost that election. And that's the difference, that, you know, the government of the day wins an election on a manifesto, and that's their programme for government. When you lose, it's the worst thing that can happen, and you know a part of that is coming to terms with the offer that you made and then revisiting into one that people want for their country. So I can't tell you now that something from a 2019 manifesto will be in one in 2024. That's not how it works for an opposition. You use your time in opposition, of course, to scrutinise the government's plans, but also to build for the future, and we're in that process at the moment. So I can't tell you line by line what that'll be, and I don't think you'd expect me to.
But Alex, do you agree on principle that a cap is the right thing to do? I mean, that's a principle question. We're not asking for the details of what would be in your manifesto.
The problem with that, Laura, is that you're asking for one single element of a social care system that needs entirely reforming, because actually there are profound questions about workforce. The biggest question of all is, where should people be cared? People generally want to be cared at home. OK, so you have to deal with that as well.
But Alex, you're a Shadow Care Minister, and the discussion around capping the costs for families has been discussed for more than a decade. It was actually passed into legislation in 2014 as part of the Care Act. You know, this is a pretty simple, principled question. Is it the right thing still to cap costs for families or not? Would you go about it a completely different way?
Well, I know that the academic consensus is broadly around a cap, and of course the Dilnot report was probably the most totemic example of that. But what I'm saying is, Laura, is you're asking for one tiny bit, a look at the painting through the keyhole rather than the whole piece. And I don't think it's reasonable to do that. And I think we'd spend the rest of the show designing the entire service as I see it. I don't think that would be wise. Could I say that I categorically am against a cap? No, I couldn't say that at all. As I say, there are a lot of strong arguments for it. But before I say to you that I'm ready to sign up in 2 years' time to a cap, I'd like to know what we're going to do with the rest of the system. So I couldn't do that.
Helen, can we talk a bit about access to care? Because many people need care, but they aren't necessarily entitled to it. The King's Fund says in the last 5 years, 120,000 extra people requested social care, but there are, in fact, fewer people receiving care now compared to then. Will your announcement improve access to care?
So our reform package, and it is much broader, and to pick up on what Alex was talking about, though I am very surprised that Labour still hasn't decided whether they support a cap.
And we'll come back to that. But in terms of a sort of information gathering, so will it make it easier for people to access care?
So our reforms are broader than specifically the cap, including, as I mentioned, the extra support for workforce. There's a separate thing which is about the rising demand for social care and, for instance, changing demographics and needs. That will be picked up in the spending review and worked through with local authorities in that as part of that process. So this particular package is around the reform of the system.
Right, but at the moment we don't yet know then the shape of what is going to happen to social care, whether more people will be able to access it and whether the quality of the care they can access is actually going to improve.
Well, actually, I'm really pleased you brought up quality, because that's a really important part of this package, and also actually of some of the reforms that we're already working on through the Health and Social Care Bill that's already going through Parliament. So, for instance, there's extra funding that will go through to local authorities to help make sure they pay the fair rate of care for those who receive state funding. So
but it will then be up to local authorities to decide how they use that money. So how will the quality of the care improve?
So, as I said, as that funding goes through to local authorities, they can use it to increase the amount that they pay for care. We're investing in the workforce and the workforce skills and development. Now, just while I mention the workforce, I mean, during the pandemic, we know the care workforce has been amazing, gone the extra mile, been through so much, super skilled and compassionate workforce. We want to support them more, help them develop their careers more.
So you're going to pay them? Are you going to pay them for them then?
Valued. So in this package, 500 million for workforce skills and development. And so pay is a separate thing, and the funding that goes through to local authorities with the cost of care comes in the spending review.
But ironically,
also,
you will...
Quality, I mean, I just think it's really important. Also, our funding, our reforms here will look at housing and make sure we have the right housing for people who have care needs. Innovation, use of technology. There's a much broader set of things in this proposal. So it is a big, bold reform, looking across quality as well as the whole point about giving people peace of mind about care costs.
But when the issue with a lot of this, when you hear from people in local government and councils and also in the care sector, is that they say, well, it's great to have that wish list. Of course, everybody would want better housing, better access, better use of technology to improve the system. They just look at this, and I've been having conversations in the last 24 hours with people just say that all sounds very well, but the amount of cash that's being proposed to go in after a decade of a real squeeze on council budgets, we know that in real terms, money in lots of places just kind of went down and down and down and down, despite the enormous figures that gets bandied around. And essentially the concern is that money will be poured into a bucket that's already got lots of holes in the bottom. But the reforms, when they emerge, and from the Minister should be coming forward with a white paper, sometime, I think you said this year, when we get those actual changes in black and white, it's only really then that we'll be able to sort of assess the concrete impact that this will have on the kind of care that people receive. But the concerns about finances are huge. Brief word on the politics, though. You could see from the moment Boris Johnson stood up yesterday, part of what he's trying to construct here is a narrative where he's been able to kind of snooker the Labour Party to vote against more money for the NHS, wrap himself in those 3 big letters, and the belief in Downing Street is that a tax rise will be accepted and worn by the public as long as that big price tag is marked health, and people will go for it. And it's a big concern in the Tory party, though, that it's another example of Boris Johnson's sort of big state, big spending. But in Downing Street, the belief is that the public will go for this.
And that's a problem for you, isn't it, politically, Alex Norris, and the Labour Party, as to where you are on this?
Well, we're talking about tax on hard-working people up and down the country, and we're talking about care for some of the most vulnerable. We talk a lot about the elderly, but also adults with lifelong conditions who make up about half of the group that we're talking about. So I'd be lying if I said I put the political concerns at the top of that list. We need to do the best by those people, and at the moment we're not, and this government hasn't for 10 years, and now their big fix, their big reform, isn't reform at all. As I say, for the vast majority, we'll have no change at all to them. So actually, that's what I care about, and that's what I think the government should care about too.
Right. I mean, Alex Norris, you said the political concerns aren't at the top of your list, and I know polls, I'm sorry if you've got a cough or a frog in your throat, and I know the polls aren't everything, but you will have seen them, and the public's appetite for a national insurance rise, because they do associate it, rightly or wrongly, with a sort of insurance policy connected to the NHS, is more popular than other ways of raising those funds. Do you accept that?
Well, I accept the polling is as it is today. I wouldn't deny reality, but I'd say this to people, that if this was such a great plan, if this was the decades-long reform that we've been waiting for, why on earth was it announced 24 hours ago and being voted on before we can properly consider what it really means, get expert input on it? Don't take it from me that this is you're being sold a pup. Take it from the Prime Minister, because he himself is just trying to shove it through before people notice.
Right. I mean, Helen, when he stood on the steps of Downing Street, Boris Johnson said, we have a plan ready to deal with social care. Was he thinking he was going to do it by raising national insurance then?
So we've been working on the details from the time when I was made Care Minister in February, just as the pandemic was hitting us, on the social care reforms and discussing, for instance, things like caps and indeed what we've done as part of these reforms.
I was asking about how he was going to raise the money when he stood on the steps of Downing Street and also said that we wouldn't raise any of the headline rates of tax. But we do have a plan to deal with social care. Was that how he was going to pay for it?
As I said, that plan was already, and the thing that I've worked on over this, even through the pandemic, but of course the pandemic meant we had to absolutely focus on the frontline needs of the health and social care system during the peak of that. Now we've come through to where we are, and we're able to get on with this, and there's not a moment to waste. So I'm really pleased we're getting on and voting on it and getting on with it and doing it as fast as we can.
I think the suggestion that this was exactly the plan that Boris Johnson had in mind in July 2019 is somewhat at odds with the fact that I know that on very late on Monday night, in fact at around 11 p.m, one quite important element of who was going to pay and how much was still being debated and argued about between number 10 and number 11. So yes, but as Helen suggests, the government clearly thinks lots of people are going to go, phew, thank goodness they're doing something, right? This has been done by successive governments, but the real test is going to be in the years to come. does families' agony and heartache over this and people's experiences actually improve or not? And the government might find they've created a problem with expectation.
Right. And in terms of how this has all changed, the political landscape, already changing, of course, because of COVID, Laura, but this idea about the Conservatives, as we discussed earlier in the programme, can they still claim to be the party of low taxation, more state involvement? Where does it leave the Labour Party? How is that all going to sort of roll out?
I think it's very tricky for the Labour Party. I mean, they're being squeezed on a territory that traditionally has been theirs to occupy. I think it's a continuation rather than a reversal of the kinds of things that Boris Johnson has been doing, exacerbated by COVID, which in an emergency massively increased the size of the state to deal with the emergency, as you would expect. But we already sort of knew from him before then his fondness for spending money on infrastructure, not particularly attached to any ideology. And you're seeing this now with some Conservatives, you know, quite worried about the size of the state that he feels comfortable with. And that's going to be a really, really interesting thing to watch.
Are you worried about the size of the state? You've only got a few seconds, Helen.
No, I mean, I think we're being fiscally responsible about this. We're being upfront about the cost of what needs to go into health and social care. We're raising it through a tax, we're being open with the public, and we're seizing this moment for this once-in-a-generation reform.
All right, we've taken us to the end of the programme. Thank you to all of my guests, and it's goodbye from us.